Hi everybody. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of software that you can install on your computer. And as I was getting ready to make this lesson and talk about this stuff, I came to the realization that just like with life, computers have changed a lot even since I started teaching. Back when I started teaching, this part of the course was pretty straightforward. Um, you would buy a computer and then you would figure out the programs that you want to have on the computer. You'd go to the store and you'd buy the disks that you need to install the software on your computer. And that was, for the most part, it. And then along came the internet. And the internet changed everything about how we do everything, but software is certainly probably near the top of the list in terms of changing. Um, Now, going to the store and buying software is not something that happens too often. Usually if we want to install programs or software, apps as we call them on our computers, we just, we go to the Windows Store, or we go to the App Store, or we go to the Google Play Store, and we just download them and install them. And most of the time it's free. And, if there's a cost, sometimes it's minimal. So this page that I just got to, you can see it's in 2020, and it says 15 must-have Windows applications you should install. You just got a new computer. What should you put on it? And if you go through the list, there's lots of things you're going to recognize, like Google Chrome, so you can browse the internet, and there's a cloud storage, Google Drive, and here's music streaming, Spotify. Here's an Office suite, and we're going to talk about what these things are. But some of these are programs that you would download and install on your computer, and some of these are services that you would use. Like Google Drive is more of a service than it is a program, and then others like Paint.net, this is a free thing that I can go get on the internet for free, which is very cool. And I can go on and on. There's lots of stuff that I can have. So it turns out that even this part of software has changed. So I'm going to go through a few things here. And first we're going to start with commercial versus open source. And the best way for me to do this is kind of go back in time a little bit. And it used to be that if I wanted to install Microsoft Office, for example, Microsoft Office consists of a suite of tools like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. It's all those programs. It's called an Office suite. And it used to be that I would go to the store, buy it, and it was fairly expensive. Like we're talking $100, $200, depending on the version. And I'd bring it home and I would install it on my computer, and that was my copy. I owned that copy of that software. Now, the internet's changed so that if I wanted to, I can still go and buy a copy of Microsoft Office, but I would probably download it. I'd probably pay for a license key, and instead of me going to the store, I would just download it from online, and then I just run the install program, and I've got it right away. But both of those cases, Microsoft Office is what we call a commercial product. And a commercial product is a product that is made by a company with the intention of making money. So Microsoft Office, I'm going to buy it. Adobe Photoshop, I'm going to buy it. Adobe, Microsoft, those are companies that want to make money. And believe it or not, Google is a company that wants to make money. And you might be sitting there going, well, I don't pay for my Google stuff, and we'll talk about that. But commercial software is software that you can go out and you can buy, install it on your computer at home, and it's your copy. It's on your computer at home. And that is sort of a dying breed. It's getting more and more common to, instead of buying pieces of software, it's getting more common to use services. And so I'm going to come back to this document, but I'm going to switch from here to something called cloud computing. And this is the second sheet that you're going to work on today. And you might have heard the term cloud. What is the cloud? Where is the cloud? Are we in the cloud now? And the answer is, well, sort of. Cloud computing is different because when you are working in the cloud, it means you're using software that's not installed on your computer. So a good example is exactly what I'm in right now, Google Docs. I don't have Google Docs installed on my computer. In fact, you can't really install Google Docs on your computer. It's not a thing. Google Docs is a service that Google provides me, and I can use Google Docs to make a Word document, or a word processing document. And anybody in the world who has the desire can go and get themselves a Gmail account, a Google account, and when they do that, they get a quote free. They can use Docs for free and Sheets for free and all that stuff, and many people do, and I do, and it's great, fantastic software. It's very easy to use, but there are some trade-offs. So cloud computing is when your computer is accessing the internet in order to use software that's on another computer. And right there is kind of the weird part, and some would say the scary part, because you don't really know where your data is. If I write a Google Doc, yes, I know that it's on my Google account, but I don't know where the data is being stored. And I haven't gone through the Google agreement. When I signed up for a Gmail, somewhere along the way, I agreed to a terms of service, and I'm not exactly sure what I agreed to. All I know is that now I get free Gmail and free Google Docs and free all this stuff. And by the way, I'm using Google as an example, but Office 365 is the same thing. We use these services. And for education, it's a little bit different. I don't want to scare you. You can totally use all this stuff for education, but it's just a different way of having software. So if I want to use, Google Docs, I don't have to have Google Docs installed on all the computers that I work on. I just have to have internet access, and then I go to the website and this word processor appears. Whereas here, this is on my computer. Here's a commercial piece of software that I've installed on my machine, and when I click it, Microsoft Word is going to open up, and this is on my computer. This is not on the internet. Only I have access to Microsoft Word here, and that's the big difference. So here's Microsoft Word, commercial product. I've installed it on my computer, and here's Google Docs. They look very similar, but Google Docs can be accessed anywhere, and it does many of the same things. So Google Docs, Apple's iCloud, Amazon Cloud, they've all the big companies. I'm sure that somewhere, some way, you use cloud software. And also now cloud hardware is starting to come out, and many of you might be working on a Chromebook right now. So Chromebooks are essentially cloud hardware, where a Chromebook goes as far as to many Chromebooks will not even function very well unless they're connected to the internet. Everything is working off of the Google servers. So the computer turns on, it connects to the Google servers, it uses all the software on the Google computers. So there's computers sitting somewhere probably in California or something like that, and they're sitting there hosting. They hold all the data, they've got all the stuff needed to run, a Chromebook well, and it's just a very different concept because, like I said, all of the information is in what we call the cloud. So the cloud is just referring to software that's on another computer somewhere out there on the internet. And later in the course, we're going to learn a little bit more about how the internet works. So maybe that will help to make sense of all of this. Now, you'll see here there's a section called Arguments Against the Cloud, which I find very interesting. I'm starting to look more and more into cybersecurity and the lack of attention that our society generally pays to privacy. So the question is, we've all signed up for these services. Again, don't worry about education. Education is a little different, but what exactly are we signing up for? Where is our data going? Do we trust that Google is always going to safeguard our data? Do we trust that all that stuff in the Apple iCloud is always going to be there? And then who actually owns the data? So if something were to happen where there were bad people out there with storing bad things on Apple's server, and then the police were to come and say, hey, we want access to that, is it Apple's job to give up that data? Who actually owns it? There's a lot of very interesting things that you have to think about when you're using what we call cloud software, which is, not necessarily, well, not on your system. So if I'm storing all of my data on someone else's computer, some other company's computer, do I still own it? And that's an interesting question. It depends on what you signed away on when you signed those agreements to use the service. So there's commercial software, which I talked about, and here's an example of commercial software, Microsoft Word. I could also open up, I won't, but I could open up Adobe Photoshop, and there's another piece of famous commercial software. That's a photo editor that I would have to pay for, and I install it on my computer. Commercial software. And then here's here Google Docs. So I'll go here, Google Docs, this cloud computing document. Google Docs is an example of cloud computing software where I can sign up for a service and I use their software as long as I have a connection to the internet. The other one I want to talk about is called open source software. And open source software is a little different than both of them. It's kind of like a cross between commercial and cloud. Because open source software, the hook is that open source software is free. Legally free. And that used to be a bigger deal than it is now, because I used to be able to say, hey, you can go get this open source software for free, and everybody would be like, oh, amazing, now we don't have to pay for Microsoft Office. But now kids say to me, well, I'm not paying for Office as it is, because you're using cloud software. Cloud software generally is free, but I heard an interesting saying the other night, or that really made me think, if you're not paying for the product, you probably are the product. Which means essentially, yeah, you're not paying to use Google Suite, you're not paying to use the Microsoft Office 365 online, but they might be, taking a look at your data. For example, a while back, I hurt my back, and I emailed a friend saying that I'd hurt my back, and all of a sudden I noticed that ads for chiropractors were popping up in my feed. So when you say cloud software is, quote, free, it's free-ish in terms of maybe I don't have to pay any money, but I am giving up something in order to use it. I'm agreeing to a licensing term. Open source software is basically software that you are encouraged to use for free, and you're actually encouraged to download the source code if you want to, and you can kind of get involved in writing the code that makes that product. And you can see the code for free. The open source movement is a very interesting movement in computers where a bunch of people got together and basically said, we think software should be freely accessible for all people. We think all people should be able to download and install these programs. They shouldn't have to pay for it. They shouldn't have to agree to licensing or cloud agreements. They should just be able to use it. Okay? And open source software really changed how things were being done in the past. So like Microsoft Word, for example, it was always a paid program. And through the open source movement, open source kind of influenced Microsoft Word becoming a cloud service where people could use it, quote, for free. And now you're starting to see that commercial software, at least for the home user, is not as popular as it used to be. So, like I said, open source software is the source code is included with the compiled version, which means that if you want to, if you're a programmer, you can actually go and take a look at the code. Imagine the people from Adobe. If the people from Adobe who make Photoshop, if the kind of the recipe for making Photoshop got out, then they'd be in trouble. Let's think of a better example, actually. McDonald's. They have a secret recipe to make the Big Mac just the way they make it every time. I'm sure they don't want to share that exact recipe online. That's how they make money. But open source software is basically saying, hey, here's the recipe. You think you can make it better? Go ahead and make it better. That's exactly what we want. So the open source movement is saying, hey, let's share, and you don't have to worry about paying money. These are the criteria for the open source movement. If you have a product that you've made in the software industry and you want it to be considered open source, these must be true. It must be freely distributed. Source code must be included. Anyone must be allowed to modify the source code if they want to. The modified versions can be redistributed, and the license must not require the exclusion of other software or interfere with the operation of other software. And so that's open source software. So I have a word processor on my computer called Microsoft Word. Let's just go take a quick look over here, and I'm going to open a new tab, no tricks here. I'm going to write open source word processor Mac, because I'm running a Mac. And it says best Microsoft Office alternatives for Mac, best free open source Office Suites word processors. Let's try this one. So I click here, and just with a couple of clicks, I'm finding a product called LibreOffice, which I could install. OpenOffice. Here's one that looks similar. So just like that, I found a whole bunch of products that I could download and install for free, and I could use with no strings attached. Here's one called Bean. So just to prove my point and how easy it is, I'm gonna do it. So I'm gonna click on this. I've never heard of this one actually, Bean. So I click on Bean. There's a word processor, and so I just go, okay, download, and boom. Let's save it. Hopefully it won't take too long. Yep, there it is. So I'm going to click on this, and now I'm going to go to downloads. There's the Bean install. Well, let's open it up, see what it looks like. And just like that, that quickly, I just went and downloaded and installed an open source word processor program where I can type stuff in, and there's, you know, the fonts, and it doesn't look exactly like Microsoft Word, and I've never used this one before, but some people would like the simplicity of it, and people can get to use it. So I'm gonna cancel, don't save. But that was just a totally, 1 minute. I suddenly have a word processor because I can just go online and get it. And there are so many of these. So if I had these ones preloaded, but there's a website called osalt.com, and at Osalt they specialize in giving you the open source as an alternative. So here are the top 10 open source programs that people download. Here's the top 10 commercial. So if I click on Photoshop, just for example, so here's Adobe Photoshop, and here are the open source alternatives that I could try out. So if I can't afford Photoshop, I could go and click on this one, see if it works better. Over here, I typed in open source alternatives of 2020. Here are the top 10 open source software examples of 2020. Mozilla Firefox is a web browser, which, hey, look at that, I'm using, and it's open source. I'm using that right now. LibreOffice, and if you're interested in Microsoft Office, and you can see here, unlike Microsoft Office, which is not accessible for everyone due to its pricing model, LibreOffice is totally free. So you can go and download LibreOffice and install it, and suddenly you have a word processor, you have a spreadsheet, you have like a PowerPoint type deal. That's another open source piece of software. GIMP is the one you just saw. This is an alternative to Photoshop, and I just happen to have both on my computer. I won't run it, but GIMP is another popular one. There's a media player, VLC media player. I'm realizing I have a lot of these. That will play any movie file you can think of. It's quite amazing. Linux is one we talked about just yesterday. We talked about operating systems, and Linux, oh, look at that. 83.1% of all developers claimed Linux is the most wanted platform. How about that? So Linux is an operating system, free, open source. Blender, this is an interesting one, it's 3D graphics. So if you're into 3D graphics and animation, you can use Blender to make 3D animation. And then we won't maybe go all the way Python. Hey, that's a programming language. And there's more and more and more. There's more links here. I'm not going to go through more. That's quite enough, I think. But there's lots and lots and lots and lots of information about open source software, and it's pretty neat just to see how many freely available pieces of software that have been invented by humans just trying to help humans. Very cool. So, at the end of this, you now know about 3 different types of software. commercial software, which is also referred to as closed source, meaning that you can't examine the source code. The source code is a secret, and you have to pay money for it. Open source, where open source we just went over, freely downloadable, and you're welcome to look at the source code and you can kind of change the recipe. And then the other one is cloud computing, which is totally different. And cloud computing is where you are using a web-based service on someone else's computer somewhere else across the world, wherever that may be. And so for each of these, at the bottom, there's a little debate area where you're supposed to find some pros and cons of using cloud software instead of traditional software. And then I want your opinion. If given the choice, would you use cloud software, open source software, traditional, commercial? You know, which one would be your favorite? Which one's your least favorite and why? And then here, I just want you to take a look, and you can use the links that I have given you. So these are here. Find an example of an open source word processor. I just kind of did that for you, Bean, and then the other one would be Microsoft Word, which would be the closed source commercial example of a word processor. I'll take that out. And then some comprehension questions, just what is the difference between open source and commercial? Why would someone use open source? Why might someone, why? And that's a valid question. If I'm telling you that open source, you don't have to pay money, why might someone prefer to pay the money and use commercial software? So you can look into that, and then a couple other questions. So there you go. Now you know everything there is to know about open source software, commercial software, and cloud-based software.